New videos every day. Life, wisdom.
So we've received comments on our channel before where people will say, I saw a study that said this, or I saw a peer-reviewed study that said this. But what do you think people should know about peer-reviewed journals and clinical studies based on your work writing for clinical journals, being a psychiatrist, contributing to these journals, and of course doing tons of research, actually going and using these journals for research?
Well, first of all, the peer review process is a good thing, and there's no alternative to it. And basically the way it works is, say I do some piece of research and I want to submit it to a journal. I write it up, and I got to make sure the references are in the right format for that journal. I email it in, and the editor or assistant editors look at it, and sometimes they'll go totally unsuitable or we don't like it. They just send it back to you. They don't send it out for review. But usually what they do is they send it out to reviewers, which are people in the field. And if it's about post-traumatic stress, they'll send it to a post-traumatic stress expert. So they have groups of experts that they use. And the person who wrote the paper doesn't know who the reviewer is, and the reviewer doesn't know who the author of the paper is.
Okay.
And then the reviewer, there's usually 2 or 3 reviewers, and they either go publish it as is, totally reject it, or if he can make the following revisions, we could consider publishing it. Then you make a whole bunch of revisions, goes back to the reviewers. In the end, it does or doesn't get accepted. And so that's kind of a quality control process, basically. And it's necessary, it's good, but it has problems and flaws.
Okay.
The problems and flaws are that oftentimes it's not too hard to figure out who the authors are because of how they reference themselves in the paper.
Okay.
And if you're in a relatively small field, it tends to be a small group of people who all review each other. So it gets to be kind of a little bit of an incestuous in club. But there's not really any way around that because it has to be the experts. So it's a good structure and process, but it's not perfect. The problem is when something gets through the peer review process and gets published, that doesn't necessarily mean it's gold, because you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of different journals, all in different subject areas, many of them really obscure, and they all have to fill themselves up. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of academics who have to publish in order to get tenure or get a grant. So there's this huge publishing machine, and all these slots have got to be filled. And there's quite a lot of competition for the slots. So what gets through is a little bit the cream of the crop. But there's so much of it that really the quality of most published research is not that tremendous, especially in psychiatry. For instance, I remember one paper I read where the paper has more authors than there are subjects in the paper. Experimental, patient participants. There was something like 15 authors and there was only 9 patients. It was some sort of brain scan study. So exactly how much can you learn from brain scans on 9 people?
Right.
And so there's many, many papers that have a small number of patients that are being studied, or there's a very unusual subgroup of patients that isn't typical of the whole population, or the finding is kind of a little iffy. So what you need is what's called replication. Replication means a bunch of different people in different centers using slightly different methods have either exactly duplicated the finding or duplicated it in kind of a similar fashion or in the same ballpark. So you start building up evidence that's not just one study by one person in one location. And this is in all of medicine, all of science, all of psychiatry. So it's really the only process we have, and I can't think of a better way to do it. But what you have to realize is just because something's published doesn't mean that's the final answer on the question. And we know this from the way things shift back and forth. For instance, mammograms. Nobody's doing mammograms because it hasn't been invented. Then everybody has to have a mammogram. Then you don't have to have a mammogram till you're 50. And then you should have it till you're 40. And then we swing back to maybe you don't need it till you're 50. And this is the official recommendations of mainstream medicine. The PSA test for prostate cancer. Everybody should get it starting at age such and such. And now, based on a recent study, the official position is flipped over to, well, maybe we shouldn't even bother with PSA tests because too many people are getting biopsies and investigated, and turns out they don't have cancer, or too much of the time, they're going to die of something else anyway. There's no need to even diagnose and treat the cancer. And so the official position of should we do PSA screening or not has actually changed in the last couple of years. So then the peer-reviewed studies from before that gave you the final word on the subject, it wasn't actually the final word. So you always need to be reading, with a critical eye, take it all with a grain of salt.
And one thing that, when I was taking science classes in college, one of the things that kind of stood out to me was that they always said, this is a constantly changing thing. There's always going to be new studies, new findings, new this. So you never really, certainly there are some things that they know, they understand how this process works, they have an understanding, but there's always this acceptance that, things could change and there can be new findings and things like that. So I think that's a good kind of thing to remember, as you mentioned that, sometimes you have a finding that says this, and then a couple years later it says that. And, we see a lot of comments on our channel that people say, God, this information's confusing, all this conflicting information, and it changes all the time.
It's a tough thing to know what to do. And in the end, you have to kind of read the information critically and go with the best information available. There's nothing else you can do. And the best information available may turn out to be right on, somewhat off, or a long way off down the road. So there's any topic you could choose, that would be true. In psychiatry, the problem is that we don't have a lot of really solid information. Like, say, how does penicillin work and what bacteria does it work on? Completely nailed down. There's nothing more to research on that. But in terms of how the brain works and what that's got to do with mental health problems, we don't really have solid facts at all. So we tend to rely on the biggest body of literature that we have in psychiatry is clinical trials. So we rely on that a lot. But there's tons of problems with those clinical trials.
And I think, when you're describing this peer review process, one of the first potential problems that came to mind, at least for me, was that, as you pointed out, if you've got this kind of small group of people who are the experts and they kind of become the facilitators of whatever information is published in this journal, well, then, this journal is now based on the bias of these peer reviewers, and maybe they're experts in their field or whatever, but each individual person is going to have a bias. And when I was going through and looking at clinical studies, that kind of started to become clear to me. And you could see that, in their conclusion, you could kind of start seeing what their bias was, or maybe what they were looking for, and they get these certain amount of results and then they make a conclusion on it. Often the conclusion is needs more research.
You can always safely say needs more research. That's a giant problem in psychiatry because most of what psychiatrists know, like it's a genetic biological brain disease, or antidepressants are very effective, or antipsychotics or other psych meds, those conclusions, those facts, are actually disproven by the clinical trial results that are in the literature. So it's not just a matter of sort of bias where you kind of, shove reality over a couple inches. It's the conclusion and the propaganda is actually disproven clearly by the clinical trials. And so drug-oriented psychiatrists, always the big buzzword or the big mantra now is evidence-based medicine. So they claim to practice evidence-based medicine, and they tend to poo-poo psychotherapy, because there's dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of antidepressant drug trials because they're all funded by the drug companies who have tons of money. But the little guy sitting in his office doing psychotherapy doesn't have $4 billion of revenue a year. But although they claim to be evidence-based, what they actually do is reach a conclusion that's disproven by the evidence. So actually, most of the psychiatry drug literature, the evidence proves that there's at most a little gap between how well the drug works and placebo, at most. But the conclusion is they're powerful and effective. So it's actually anti-evidence medicine that they practice.
And they're just trusting that the average person isn't going to actually go and read the clinical trial. They're just going to say, this is supported by peer-reviewed trials, and just repeat whatever the
And if you go
is.
to the peer-reviewed trials, you can look at dozens of them and you'll see, oh yeah, here's how much the score drops on the placebo. Here much on the drug, the depression score drops this much. The difference is this much. Here's the statistic, and it's significant.
Right.
So, and point number one is you have to have hundreds of people to get statistical significance because the gap is so small.
Right.
So the problem is not, it isn't statistically significant. The problem is, okay, it's statistically significant, but what's the clinical meaning of that?
Right.
Is it actually real-world significant?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you measured 25,000 things, you could easily find some little significance about something in there somewhere.
Right.
And that's why you have to have huge numbers of patients. But the real big problem comes from the peer-reviewed literature that never got published. All the studies of antidepressants in particular that never got published, by and large, they tend to be the ones where there's no difference at all between drug and placebo. So if you look at all the published studies, you see this gap. Okay, it's statistically significant. It's really not very big.
Right.
But then when you add in all the studies that aren't published, that difference between the drug and placebo goes to 0 for mild, moderate depression. And even for severe depression, the difference is just under 2 points on the Hamilton Depression Scale that goes from 0 to 51.
Huh.
So like the people on drug, they might end up at 13 and on average, and the people on placebo are like 14.7.
Right.
Well, you can't tell the difference between those two people clinically.
So we've got the issue that the group that's peer reviewing is, consistent throughout this journal. And so the voice that's coming from the peer reviewed could be a potential bias. The people funding the research could be area for a potential bias. And as you've illustrated, if the drug company does some research and they don't like the findings, you just don't publish the materials at all. And then, especially while we're talking about, psychiatry, but even, would apply to health or any of the different clinical trials that, that people have brought up to us and sometimes will send us and say, hey, I found this. This completely disproves everything you say. Is that there's a lot of different factors, certainly for something like mental health. And so you have these clinical trials, which are seeking to, have take a section of the population that is supposed to represent the normal population, but they have all these qualifying factors that they have to meet. So
exactly.
Maybe your test pool isn't actually representative of the real population.
And nothing ever gets proven or disproven by one study anyway.
Right. And I think that's a really important point just in and of itself.
Another example, totally outside psychiatry, the FDA just approved a new drug for pancreatic cancer because it's effective. But what does that drug actually do? Well, we know all chemotherapy drugs have horrible side effects. Mm-hmm. And we know cancer of the pancreas, most of the time you don't live a year. Often you only live 3 or 6 months from the time of diagnosis. Horrible, horrible cancer. Mm-hmm. So if, say, you've got 6 months left to live, do you want to spend those 6 months with horrible chemotherapy side effects and spending most of your time at doctor's appointments and getting IVs? Or would you like to just maybe make it to the Caribbean for a couple of weeks? So this new drug that's been approved by the FDA increases your lifespan by under 2 months. Okay, so that's a scientific fact, apparently. It does, in fact, increase your lifetime from, say, 4 months to 6 months or 7 months to 9 months. But is that really an advance in cancer treatment? When you balance quality of life, right. And then you look at the thousands and thousands of dollars that these drugs cost, like $6,000 a month, mm-hmm. $8,000 a month when they first come out. Are we really any further ahead?
Right.
Is that clinical trial really telling us what the best decision to make is in life?
Right. And I think when we consider, that point about the funding of the trials, well, no trial just happens of its own accord. Somebody funds that trial. And so you brought up a really interesting point, which is, well, you've got the drug companies who have tons and tons of money to do as many tests as possible on these drugs until they get the results that they want. But for instance, somebody who works in psychotherapy or somebody, looking at cancer, somebody who works in natural treatments or dietary treatments of cancer, they just don't have the money to do clinical trials. And why on earth would a drug company do a clinical trial on something that it can't patent and sell?
They wouldn't. So the net conclusion I come to is the peer-reviewed process is here to stay. It's the best we've got. It's necessary. I agree with it. I participate in it. Mm-hmm. But there's still lots of problems, lots of errors. Nothing really gets nailed down and proven by one study. You always have to be critical. You always have to look at what are the limitations, what are the biases. Right. And science in theory is this kind of objective, unbiased enterprise. Mm-hmm. But science doesn't just happen like in the air. Scientists have to do it. Right. And scientists are human beings who've got biases and prejudices and ambitions and just like anybody else.
Potentially.
Greed. Yeah, trying to get promotion, trying to score points.
Right. Just to end here, will you share, there's a little anecdote that you shared about your first experience taking part in a clinical trial. This is something you discussed in one of our first videos.
A drug called buspirone or Buspar, which is an anti-anxiety drug. So it's an alternative to Valium in that group because it's not so sedating and it doesn't affect your ability to drive a car. And so I was involved before it came on the market. And I published a paper in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry. And I got, just from that drug study, which had 30 people in it, that I totally ran and evaluated all the people, ran them through the protocol and everything, wrote the paper. From that one study, I got trips. I was in Canada, so I got trips to Calgary, Ottawa twice, Toronto, Houston, Dusseldorf, and Italy. Wow. That was the perks I got from that one drug trial. So I'm over in Dusseldorf, which is the first country in the world where Buspar is coming on the market. It was about a year before it came on the market in the U.S. And so one country, Germany, it's fairly big, but not that big. It's not China. Mm-hmm. There's 300 or so psychiatrists from all around the world, North America, South America, mostly from Europe. We were flown in first class. We stay at the Hilton. We have dinner on a boat that's reserved for us going up and down the Rhine. Wow. We're in the big hall. So this is 85. There's 2 giant Jumbotron screens, simultaneous translation, whole thing paid for by the drug company.
Wow.
Just for the launch in one country. And so I'm there and I'm talking to the guy who's kind of like the biggest drug study guy in Canada at the time. And I'm saying to him, well, in my study, there's no difference at all between the Valium, the Buspar, and the placebo. And his response was this your first clinical trial? I go, yeah. He says, oh, that happens all the time in the first trial. When you get the hang of it, you'll learn not to spend so much time with the patients, not to be so therapeutic with them, and then you'll get a difference between drug and placebo. So he was actually coaching me how to manipulate the situation to increase the difference between drug and placebo.
By helping the people less.
But I wasn't helping them, was the crazy thing. They come in for an hour, the first interview. There's a whole bunch of pages. You go question, check, check. Next page, check. And then you give them a requisition for blood work, an EKG. You check their pulse and their blood pressure. That takes an hour. And you ask them a bunch of questions about anxiety. They come back for 15 minutes. And you go through question check. How are you doing? Side effects? Okay, see you next week. And that happens 4 or 5 times. And then the last visit, again, is about an hour. And you're just going through these standardized questions. Check. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's the therapy, so-called.
Really?
So I guess I was supposed to be grumpier or something.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like I was doing any therapy.
But the fact that, this, kind of renowned scientist is actually telling you, oh, yeah, you'll learn how to manipulate the data as you go. That's just shocking.
And that's the way it works.
Wow. Well, Dr. Ross, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a very interesting discussion.
You're most welcome.
Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to leave your questions, your comments, your criticisms down below in the comments section. Be sure to subscribe to Psychiatry so that you never miss a video. We post a new video every single day on topics in health and wellness to help you take control of your health and your happiness. Till next time, I'm Psychiatry correspondent Karina Rachel. Thanks for watching.